APIs allow you to leverage the data or service of other apps for you to use in your own app. You can integrate functionality such as AI, payments, email, or mapping, and also integrate data such as social media posts, music, films, or the weather. And this is how many of the apps you use on a day-to-day basis actually work, by interacting with third-party APIs to leverage the functionality and the data that these services provide. And by using APIs, businesses and developers can save time and resources, as there's no need to build complex systems from scratch when you can already use existing services. For instance, instead of training your own large language models, you can simply connect to OpenAI, Claude, or Gemini APIs and use these next-generation AI services within your own app. Instead of building a library of films in your app, you can simply connect to the Netflix API and retrieve all of the films that you need. You're essentially using their database instead of your own. And instead of building a complex billing and subscription management system from scratch, you can integrate the Stripe API to handle all of these things for you. In this course, I'm going to show you how to build an app that leverages RESTful APIs to manage a property booking system that uses Airtable as a backend. And by using a different backend, I'll be able to demonstrate the core HTTP methods, which are get, post, put, delete, and patch. And these methods are fundamental for interacting with RESTful APIs. Each method serves a specific purpose in the process of creating, reading, updating, or deleting resources on a server. But hang on, what do I mean by RESTful? Well, REST, or representational state transfer, is not actually a protocol, but more a set of guidelines that define how a client and a server should interact with each other. In other words, a developer can technically build an API to follow any kind of structure they want. But REST is a widely adopted style of architecting APIs that are flexible, scalable, and easy to understand. This makes it easy for different systems to talk to each other, as their developers prepare it to follow the same method of communicating. Let's use the analogy of an online shopping cart. For get, we would be browsing products without buying anything. Post would be adding a new product to the shopping cart. Patch would be changing the quantity of an item in your cart. And delete would be removing an item from your cart. We can even apply this to how Bubble interacts with our own database, which is actually hosted externally by Amazon Web Services. Bubble also needs to leverage their APIs to save and manipulate data for our apps. So get would be do a search for and display data. Post would be create a new thing. Patch, make changes to thing. And delete the thing. So how do we interact with APIs? Well, of course, you can install a plugin, which already does this for you. But in this course, I want to really focus on the API connector, as this enables you to build your own custom integrations just the way you'd like to. But before we do that, let's take a quick look at what we're building. I'm going to show you how to build this property management app, where we can view properties via get calls. Here's a list of properties in a repeating group, and I can click on one to view more information. We'll be able to create new properties from scratch. That would be a post call. We'll be able to edit a property. If I just click on this little icon, I'm taken to a edit listing page. When we change information in one of these fields, or as many fields as we'd like, that would be a patch method. Let me go back. And we can also delete, which is the delete method. Now let me show you what it looks like from the Bubble editor. So this is the application, and if I show you the listings page, here are my listings. Now you can see on the right hand side for the data source, I'm actually getting this data via a get call from Airtable. And there's absolutely nothing in the database in Bubble, everything will be managed via Airtable, because this is a really nice way to show you how to set up all of these calls, right? Switching across to Airtable, here are the listings: title, description, location, size, price, and the images. Let me switch back to Bubble. And these are the listings from that Airtable database. If we go to the plugins page, I'm going to show you what the API connector quickly looks like, and then we'll get started. So here are all of my calls to get my listings, create my listings via the form, patch my listings, which is updating something in an existing listing, and then delete the listings. I also have get a single listing. Instead of grabbing a huge list of listings, I can also get a single listing via an ID. And then we've got some bonus material, such as creating bookings as well, using the Stripe API. I'm going to switch back to my blank app so we can start building this. Okay, so here we are. I've got a type of content user. This is just a placeholder, but I've got absolutely no data source. And in plugins, I have nothing installed either. So let's go ahead and install the API connector. Okay, straightforward. Now the API connector allows you to connect to almost any external API from Bubble. And these APIs can be used in actions in your app, such as asking OpenAI to summarize an article, or to display data, such as fetching and displaying a list of films from Netflix. So let's go ahead and set up our first Airtable API call to get our list of properties from Airtable to display in our Bubble repeating group. So I'm going to add another API. I'm going to call this Airtable. And before we get to authentication, we actually need to read the documentation. Let's jump across to Airtable. Okay, so it's really important to get familiar with API documentation. And the format of this documentation will usually follow a similar format. You'll have an introduction, which you need to read. They'll talk about rate limits, authentication, and how to actually architect these calls, etc. But within API documentation, a lot of these providers have written them slightly differently. So it's something that you'll get used to over time. Earlier on, I talked about RESTful, which is not a protocol. It's rather a set of agreed methods. Okay, so API documentation does differ, but once you get used to it, you'll see familiar patterns within that, which will easily explain how to work with those particular APIs. So what's nice about the Airtable API is I have asked it to integrate the documentation with my existing Airtable database or table. That is called Property Listings Management. Here we go, Property Listings Management. Here is all the information. Now, the Property Listings Management API provides an easy way to integrate your property listings management data in Airtable with any external system. The API closely follows REST semantics, uses JSON to encode objects, and relies on standard HTTP codes to signal operation outcomes. Now that sounds like a mouthful, but if I would summarize this, I would say that it follows REST, so it is RESTful. Always look out for that. It uses or returns JSON objects. That's how Bubble communicates with APIs. We'll get into that shortly. The other interesting thing is I can see an ID, okay? The ID of this base, which is basically a base is a table, is this particular ID. So I suspect that within my API calls, I might actually need to reference this ID. This is why we need to read the introduction. Okay. Scrolling down, we've got information about metadata, not too important at the moment. We've got rate limits. For this course, I'm not going to cover rate limits. I'm going to go down to authentication. All right, so authentication. Looking across on the right-hand side, we always want to be on curl, okay? You might see JavaScript and a few other things, but curl is what we use within Bubble. And I can see a URL. So api.airtable.com/v0/ the ID of my base /properties. Below that, I can see -h. Now this stands for header. Okay, we're going to be adding this very shortly. And it says authorization bearer with your secret API token. Now I've already copied my API token, which is just in my settings area in Airtable. And then back on the left-hand side, it says you can authorize to use the API by providing your secret API token. Okay, let's head back to Bubble. So let's just talk about authentication for a second and why we need authentication when dealing with these APIs. Well, authentication is the process of identifying who you are as the client in order to determine what resources you have access to on the server. So Airtable can't just provision access to my database to anyone, right? Airtable needs to know it's me. I only have access to my resource. So it's much like a username and password, but not with a sign-in form on the front end, rather through these API calls. So these authentication methods are the most popular ones. In fact, you'll probably only find these with REST APIs that you want to interact with. And to give you an example of some of the more popular ones, when would we use non or self-handled? Well, that's when no authentication is actually required and it's just open public data, much like the Open Weather API. Private key and URL, I know that Google Maps uses this, though it's generally recommended to keep it in headers rather, which is the next one. And this is what Airtable uses, and it's the most popular one. Sometimes we want users to log in with accounts from a different service, like log in with Google. That would be an OAuth style authentication. But for Airtable, we're going to be using private key and header. And from the documentation, they said it needs to say bearer, space, and then the token. I'm pasting in that API key from my Airtable settings area. And don't worry, at the end of this course, that key will be deleted. If your service has a test environment, much like Bubble has a test environment, you can often get test API keys to work with. I know Stripe does this. So whenever I'm testing Stripe, I don't put anything up here, which is for the live environment. I add it to the development input down here. But for Airtable, they don't have a development area. Now any shared headers or any headers you add up here will basically apply to any API calls that we configure down below. Same with the parameters. Okay, so this is shared headers for all calls. Now some of my calls have slightly different headers, so I'm not going to add them here. I'm rather going to add them down in these specific calls. Okay, now we can expand this next section and we can say, let's call this get listings. Okay, Bubble now gives us two options, data or action. And the way to think about this is, what are we trying to achieve with this call? Well, I'm trying to basically get or fetch the listings from Airtable to display them in my repeating group. And for that, that would be used as a data, okay? And you'll see that when we get to the repeating group, just how we get to that information. If it was an action, well, that's where Bubble would expose it as a workflow step. And we will get to that when we are creating data. So I'm going to choose data. And from the documentation earlier, Airtable said that we're working with JSON, and I have that selected. Here are our methods: get, post, put, patch, and delete. And you probably noticed that I've been talking about patch more than put, and that's because with Airtable, we're going to just be using patch and not put at all. So what is the difference? Both of them are editing data, but with patch, you can edit certain fields of an existing record, like you can change the title of a listing or the price, whereas put is actually replacing the entire row in the database. So we'd always be using patch moving forward. But this is a get call. So let's go back to the documentation now because we need to look at the URL. So where are we getting our listings from? Okay, so heading down the left-hand side, we have got list records. And you can see that the terminology is slightly different here. However, in the description, it says to list records in properties. That's my property listings table. Issue a GET request to the properties endpoint. Fantastic. Moving across on the right-hand side, here is my curl command. And this is the URL that will enable me to get these records. Now there are further parameters that we can use here, such as filtering or max records, and I can see them appended after the question mark. And you'll probably know already that question mark means we are sending a parameter in the URL. But I don't want that. So I'm just going to grab this URL and stop after properties. You can see that we've got authorization bearer. We added that to the shared header section. So we don't need to do that again. I'm going to paste that in there. Fantastic. Now we've got a header section here. I haven't added any shared headers because I know from looking at the full documentation earlier that some of the headers vary slightly. Let's go back to the documentation. So it doesn't look like we have any more headers here. Okay, we've got authorization. Let me click down to retrieve a record. Or actually create a record would be better, because to create a new record, issue a post call. Going across to the documentation on the right, I can see the authorization. Well, we've done that already. But then beneath that, we have content type with the value application JSON. This is very, very popular. You'll see this with most APIs that you interact with. So for creating or post requests, we do need to add in a second header, which is the content type. But for listing records, it looks like we don't need to do that. So if we go back to Bubble, we can probably initialize this call. Okay, we don't have any further parameters. I could add a parameter. I could say fetch 10 at a time. I could use pagination. I could use a filtering parameter, and that's in the documentation. But I only have 10 properties in my Airtable database. Now, include errors in response and allow workflow actions to continue. This is slightly more advanced, and this is when you as a developer want to handle errors yourself, right? And you always need to handle errors gracefully. If you don't check it, then Bubble will handle the error for you. But it might not be the UX that you'd want, such as Bubble will show a pop-up, with some information that your end users probably won't understand. So as you gain more experience, you'll be able to have custom error messages with a bit more information for your end user. But for the sake of this course, we're going to keep it simple and ignore that. Now, sometimes you do want to capture response headers. Again, this comes with experience because response headers often have a bit more information. I'll give an example. When it comes to Stripe, securing your Stripe APIs, they provide information in the header that is unique, that only you can gain access to, and that you can use with some Bubble logic to basically secure your endpoints. Sounds a bit complicated, so we're not going to get into capturing response headers. You can always capture them if you want. No harm, it just brings down a bit more information. For the sake of the course, I'm going to leave it out. Now, initializing a call. What is this? Every call needs to be initialized before you can use it in your app. Okay, you're not going to find a call available in a workflow step or as data until you do this. And it's really done for two reasons. Number one would be to confirm that the call was set up correctly. And number two would be that Bubble uses the response to recognize the data being returned by the server. And that's going to be in JSON format. If Bubble doesn't understand what's returned, well, we can't use it in our app. Now just keep in mind that when I do click on initialize call, it's actually going to run as it would in your app. So if this was a post call to create data, when I click on initialize call, it will go off and actually create data. Okay, it needs to do this so we can confirm that the call is working and we can get a response from Airtable to say that worked. All right, that's okay. But in this instance, we're not creating anything, we're just getting, okay? We're just receiving data. So I'm going to click on initialize call. And there we go. Starting from the top, return values for get listings. And we can see we have an ID, we have a created time, so that's the time it was created in Airtable itself. And we are going to be creating data from Bubble and inserting it into Airtable. We have photos with some photo data. Price per night, $3.15. It's kind of small. Fields, we have title, size, location. And then further down, we have show raw data if you want to view it in a more structured format. Okay. Things you can do here is if you don't need certain data, you can actually just ignore it. So if I didn't want, for instance, the property ID, I could just say ignore field. And then when it comes to working with the data, that is just removed altogether. So it just makes the list of data returned just a lot smaller. Okay, so that's up to you to decide what information you want and what information to ignore. Now, the other thing you can do is actually change the type of data. So we can see that we have a field called size with 1200. So that's obviously the floor size of the property. Now, Bubble did detect this as a number, but sometimes when it comes to, for instance, dates, which are often returned in a different format, sometimes Bubble won't recognize that it's a date. So we can see created time. And below that, we can see that it is a date, but Bubble didn't recognize that. So I can change from text to date, and then we'll be able to manipulate this created time if we'd like. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and save that. And only once we save, does it become available for us to use in our app. Okay, I can also manually edit or enter the API response. If I click on this, if I want to go back and see what was returned when I initialized the call, I can just click that and I can scroll through. Now this is real information, okay? This is information from a GET call to Airtable with data that was in that Airtable base. Now, one thing to note is that sometimes we want certain bits of information to be private, because this ID here, that ID is the base ID of my Airtable table, basically. And I'd prefer that not to be public information, not public in a way that end users can access it, but it will be in the code base, and you know, if people are bored and digging around, well, they'll be able to find that base ID. So I'm going to show you a method to basically remove that part of the URL, just so it is private, only I can see it in my code base, or only I can have access to it. And on the right hand side, it says use these square brackets for params. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just copy Command C on my Mac. Then I'm going to use 2 square brackets. Inside the square brackets, I'm going to type base underscore ID. And then this creates a parameter for me to paste in the value. Okay, I'm going to paste that base ID back in. Okay, but I do need to make sure that it is checked as private, because if it's not checked as private, well, it's back in the code base. Okay, so I'm going to check as private. Now, because I've done that, Bubble says, this call has been modified, please consider reinitializing. Now, it will work without reinitializing, but there is no harm in doing this again. So I'm going to reinitialize. make sure that the parameter was set up correctly, which it was, and then save. Okay, so as it stands, we can get listings from Airtable. Let's now look at how we can use this API call to populate a repeating group. So I'm going to go back to the design tab, and here I have a blank repeating group. Now I'm going to click on the data source, and we're going to scroll down and say get data from an external API. And if I click on the drop down, I can see the call I've created, Airtable get listings. And I'm going to close that. And then it's saying just select the records as well. Okay. Now Bubble has recognized that the data source and the type of content don't match. So I'm just going to click this so that Bubble can set the type of content. Now the reason why we can access it from, let me run through this one more time. The reason why I can access it from get data from an external resource or an external API is because of the way we set up that API call. Let me show you again. Plugins, and I used as data. Okay. If I said action, then the get listings would not be showing up in that repeating group data source. Okay. So now we have the data source. Now I have to basically quickly hook it up so I can get my design to be populated with all of those listings. So I'm going to say current cells get listings and match the type of content. I'm going to get the parent. Photos. Now it's a list of different photo sizes. I'm just going to choose the large URL. Guys, this isn't overly important. The main thing is just how we communicate with Airtable. I'm just hooking up the data. And I'm just going to work my way through so we can get all of the data connected. So at this stage, can we get to the title? There's the title there. Fantastic. And I'm just going to undock this so we can see what we're doing here. Okay, that's a bit better. So the description is here. Let's see, we have another group here. So I need to reference the parent. Now we need the price. So we select the price per night. Because it's a number, we can format that as a currency. We set that up when we initialize the call. We determined that the price was a number, therefore we can format it as a number. And we have a hidden group here, which I just need to set up the data routing for. Okay, now let's preview. And there we go, guys. Airtable data in our Bubble app via a GET call. Let's now talk about creating data via a POST call. Okay, so this is much like in Bubble when we create a new thing. That is a POST call. So let's jump into the Airtable documentation and figure this out. Firstly, where will data be created? Well, it's going to be in our table. So we currently have 10 listings in the table. We'll be populating all of these fields with a form from Bubble. So over in the documentation, we have done list records. Okay, let's go down to create records. To create new records, issue a POST call. Now this looks a little bit more involved, and that's because when we create a POST call, we are sending data. Okay, we can't just create a blank row in the Airtable table. We need to send the title, we need to send the image, we need to send the price and all of the other metadata. So POST calls usually are constructed in the body of the call, which we'll have a look at. First of all, let's start at the top. So we know it's a post call to create data, and we have a URL that's kind of hard to read. But it looks like it is the same URL that we used for the get call. I can see it's the Airtable base URL with the base ID and properties. Brilliant. We're also going to use the parameter trick to hide our base ID. But then I can see we also have another header. Content type is application/JSON. Okay, so I'm going to copy the value. And let's go ahead and set up this call. So let's go back to the API connector just to confirm that we only have this Airtable list of calls so far. What I'm going to do is add another call. This one will be called create listing. Now I'm using slightly different verbs here. Okay, we said get listings. This could have been list listings or fetch listings. This could be post listing, but that doesn't feel very natural. It is a post call, but I'm just going to call it create. Now we talked about how we should use this. It's not data because we're sending data and receiving data back from Airtable via an action from a button in a form. Data type is JSON. Okay, we know it's a post call. Brilliant. Now I'm going to copy this URL because the URL looked the same to me. Let me paste that in and enter in the base ID, which I'm just going to get from the one above. That's to hide our base ID, and I'm making sure that private is checked. Now I'm going to add another header. This is content type. Very, very popular header that you'll see across most RESTful APIs. Now the value, it is case sensitive. So we're dealing with an application/JSON. Okay, private being checked is fine. This value never needs to change, and it can be private. Okay, so that's the bare bones of the call. But most of the work will involve the body. And that's because if I go back to the demo app, we need to send or collect data from these various fields and then send them in the post call over to Airtable via the save button. So if I had to click on edit workflow, I'm just going to show you what this looks like in the demo app. We have all of these available to us to dynamically set, okay? Input titles, value for the title. Let me show you how this is achieved. So I said that we'll be sending this in the body. Now, what does this look like? Let's have a look at the Airtable documentation to see how it's constructed. Now, this is showing me how to create a list of records. Over in the documentation, it says at the bottom, you can also include a single record object at the top level. Click here to show an example. And we're only creating one thing, so that's what I'm going to use instead. So this is where it can become a little bit tricky, okay? A little bit tricky. Because what I need to do is grab everything from the open bracket down to the close bracket, but excluding the apostrophes. I'm going to copy this, but don't worry, you'll get used to this method. There is also an option to import this example request into Bubble and for Bubble to do this work for us. I'm going to show you that next. But this is how you do it manually. So I've copied that. And I'm going to just paste it in here a second. Okay. So this is how we'll send the data across. Now, as it stands, these IDs, etc., and the title, these are hard-coded. And that's not actually that helpful because we want to insert dynamic data as the values here, not hard-coded. That makes no sense. But what we've just done is brought the structure across and then we can make it dynamic from here. So how do we make it dynamic? And I'm going to just show you a way of allowing us to insert dynamic values. So up here it says body JSON object, use these brackets for dynamic values. So instead of downtown apartment, I'm just going to copy this a second. Instead of that, I'm going to use dynamic values. So if I put title, that then opens up this key value pair parameter. And then I can actually dynamically feed the value from the form. I'm going to show you what this looks like. Now I can only do this if private is unchecked. By unchecking private, this allows it to show up in the workflow editor when we're dealing with the post step. I showed you the example earlier. Okay, so I would basically go through each one. So for this one, this is the description. Fine. So brackets, description, now it can be dynamically fed. Uncheck private. Okay. We do need a value in here. Now remember what I said, that when we initialize the call later, we are actually creating data on Airtable itself. So that's why we need some values in here. We can't leave them blank. We want to be able to make sure that everything is being run as an actual call when we initialize it. So I'm just adding some test data. That's absolutely fine. I can then, if I don't want that data on Airtable, I can just go ahead and delete it in Airtable itself. Now in my demo app, I'd already gone through and set up all of the dynamic values. So I'm going to switch across to the demo app and just copy and paste it here so we can get on with this lesson. So in the demo app, this is basically what it ended up looking like. Okay, so I'm just going to copy that, go back, and just paste it in there. Now all of these key value pairs become available. And I'm going to check uncheck private on all of them. And I'm just going to add some dummy data. San Francisco. Size 1500. Type villa. Price 800. Doesn't matter, guys. This is just to test. Now the URL of an image, I don't have that. So what I'm going to do is go to my demo app and go find the URL of an image. And I can just paste that in. Just want to make sure that we have HTTPS. Okay. So downtown apartments, let's just say test, just to make sure we know what we're looking at. And I think, guys, I'm probably ready to initialize. I'm going to initialize the call. And there we go. So what's being created is in here. Property ID 11, San Francisco, 1500, etc. And I can save that. Let's go now into Airtable to make sure that a record was successfully created. Over my property, and you can just see it loaded as I switched across. Here it is here. Downtown test with all of the information and the image there. Okay. So a little bit involved on the body side. I just want to show you another quick method to be able to set up the body a bit more easily. Okay. So in the documentation, I could have just actually copied all of this here like this. Copy. Back to Bubble. I could have said import another call from curl. All right, let me just collapse this call here. So we've got the create listing. We've got the get listing. So let's just say we didn't have create listing. What I could do is click on import another call from curl, paste in all that information and just say import. And then Bubble will try and make sense of it. But it does actually require a bit of editing. Let me show you. So the name, of course, would have to be, let's call it post this time. post listing. We would have to edit this to an action, but Bubbles brought in the URL successfully. We'd have to change this to our base ID. Paste that in. We can see that Bubbles then added the authorization. We already have this in the shared header at the very top. Here it is here. So we would actually have to delete that. But Bubble did bring in the content type. Fantastic. And it brought in the body. But now we'd still need to go through and make sure that these are dynamic. So this would be the ID. ID, and then we'll put in our test value. So 0, in this instance, it would be 12. Okay, so it is a bit of a shortcut, but it still does require some manual adjustments to make sure that we can insert dynamic data. Okay, we need to delete this now. Now that we've initialized this create listing call, that means that we can go across to our form that I've gone ahead and designed in advance, and we can actually set this up. So I can add a workflow, and I can say, I can come down to my plugins. Because we initialized the call as an action, it is showing up in the plugins section. You can see that the data call for get listings is not here because that is a data call. Okay, now let's show, I want to demonstrate something to you here. We can see we have all of these fields, and we can now say insert dynamic data, go and find the input title and hook it up in Bubbles, just like you're used to doing. But if I go across back to plugins and expand this, the reason I can see the title in the workflow area is because I unchecked private. If I do check private and reinitialize this call, that's actually going to say it's going to create something in Airtable. That's fine. We'll delete stuff later. That means that in my workflow area, you can see that title has now disappeared. That's because it's kept as private. But in this instance, we need to enable us to dynamically feed the title in here. So that's absolutely fine for private to be unchecked. Okay, let's go ahead and do that. Uncheck private. We're going to add a third record in Airtable. Hey, we need to test deleting data, so that's absolutely fine. Okay, so now if we go back to our form, we can hook this up. Let's continue with this. So the description is coming from a multi-line input. The description's value. The ID we would probably need, I'm going to come back to that because I need a way to dynamically determine what the ID should be, so it increments. I'm just going to do the easy ones first. So location is probably coming from a drop-down. Size, I know that this is coming from a slider value. Now villa, where does this come from? How do I set this? Type. It's coming from there. Okay, so location is just the input location, but the type is the drop down. That's fine. So location, in fact, is the input location's value. This is the drop down. Price will be coming from an input. Input price is value. And the URL, this is actually going to be coming from a page state, which I'm going to have to quickly set up. All right, so I'm going to set something up here quickly. I already have it. Image is a state, fine. So this is coming from, this isn't important, guys. Images creates image state. And then property ID, I'm going to ignore this, guys, but we would have to basically get all of the listings and then increment by one. Okay, not super important. And then I'm going to animate an element. I built a little alert myself. And we can reset relevant inputs as well. Okay, let's try this. So I'm going to preview this page. All right, let's try it. I'm going to upload an image. There is our image. Give it a title. 2-bed condo in New York. Say 240. Let's say Manhattan or Brooklyn. Brooklyn's my favorite. And size, not too big, not that big. This is an apartment. Why don't we say Williamsburg, my favorite part, or one of my favorite parts of Brooklyn. All right, time to make the call. Let's try it. Save. And successfully created in the top right-hand corner. Let's pop over to Airtable. And here we go, guys. 2-bed condo, beautiful condo in Williamsburg, New York, 600 apartments. There's the price and there is the image. Now we're going to turn our attention to patching a record. So basically editing a record, one of the fields or all of the fields if you'd like. So that is patch. Now, in order to achieve this, we actually need to first fetch the record that we'd like to patch. So we need 2 API calls, one to get the record and then one to update the record. Let's have a look at the demo. So if I hover over one of these cards, I can see these 2 icons. So we're going to focus on patching or editing. So if I click this, it's going to take me to a new page called Edit with a form, and it's going to load the data in, and it's doing that via an API call to get a single record. And it's pre-populated all of the information. And from here, we can make whatever changes we'd like, hit save, and then it takes us back to the listings. And as I said earlier, to make this happen, we need 2 calls, okay? Let's jump back into the course bubble app. So this is the edit page that I've created, and we need to pre-populate this page. And then we need to sort out the workflow for the save button. First of all, let's head over to the API connector. And we've got our get listings and create listings. So instead of getting a list of properties, we now need to get one property. So I'm going to add another call. I'm going to call this get listing single. Now we're going to be displaying this on the edit page, therefore it needs to be data. And let's have a look at the documentation. So on the left-hand side, we've gone through list records. So that is a list, of course. And if we click one down, we've got retrieve a record. We've already covered create records. So it says to retrieve an existing record in the properties table, issue a get request to the record endpoint. And obviously we need to send something with it. And I can see on the right-hand side here that I've pre-highlighted. That to me looks like an ID, and I can confirm that this is an ID we're sending across in the URL from the example response. ID equals RECS, RECS. So it looks like this curl address looks very similar for all of these calls. Okay, so I'm going to copy this. And to note, we don't have any other headers, just the shared header that we've already set up. And I'm going to paste that in. And let's do what we usually do. So base ID. That can remain private, but this part needs to be dynamic. Let's just call that ID. But this part will change, right? So it depends on which card we click on. Back in the listings page, when we hover over a card, we see the pencil icon. When we click the pencil icon, we're going to take users to the edit page, but also send across the property ID. So it needs to be dynamic. Therefore, I'll leave private unchecked so that we can dynamically fill that. And that's all we really need to do. So I'm going to go ahead and initialize the call. And it looks like that was successful. So I'm going to save that. And remember, we're using as data. So now if we go to the edit page, I can then use it as a data source. So how do we do that? Well, if we start from the listings page, because this is where the little edit icon is. And if I expand the element tree, I'm going to just keep expanding it until I can find the little pencil icon. There it is there. Okay, let's run a workflow here. And let's say navigation, go to page. We're going to go to the edit page. And let's send across a parameter, which is the property ID. Property ID, and this will be the listings records ID, which we just identified in the documentation. Okay, so that solves that part. So we have an ID. So now we're on the edit page. We need to load this single listing into this form, pre-populated with dynamic data. We know where the property ID is. It's in the URL, and it's a parameter called property_ID. Okay. So now we can say, let's get data from an external API. Now the single listing is going to turn up. Here it is here, because we initialized the call successfully. And now Bubble is saying, what is the path? What is the ID? Okay. We know where it is. So we can say, it's in the URL, so get data from page URL. It's called property ID. Fantastic. And in order to pre-populate all of the data, I'm just going to speed through this, and I'm just going to keep referencing the parent so we can pre-populate all of this, okay? So I'll do one with you here, and that's all I need to do for the rest. And then we'll continue on from when I'm at the inputs part. Okay, so I've hooked up all of the data, and now we can go into these individual fields and make sure that we're referencing the correct information from Airtable. So the data is feeding through. Now I can reference the parent for initial content. We need to pre-populate this form, remember? So this would be the title. This is the price. Location. This is the size. Parent group is missing. Let's have a look at this quickly. Okay, that's fixed. So this is the size. Type is a drop-down, but we can still pre-populate a value from the database, which is on Airtable. This is type. Need the description. Fantastic. Now we need an image. This will be the property photos first items URL. And if we think back to the create page, we were using states to handle our images. So again, not very important. This is more UX. This is an API course, so don't worry about this. But I'm going to just set up my states, which enables some cool functionality. So I'm going to say that when the page is loaded, I'm going to set state. Of the page. State is the image, and I'm going to preload the image from the database. So I need to go get that record. There it is there. Dynamically set the property ID. And then pull in the property photo. And this just enables us a bit of functionality around selecting images, then changing our mind before we save. Okay, now that that's done, I can finish off this conditional statement, which says when the page state is set, so when the image is not empty, then show the image element. When do we show the picture uploader? When the image is empty. Okay, fine. Let's go ahead now and preview listings. Okay, so we're on the listings page. Let's edit this historic townhouse. So I'm going to choose the edit icon. This is taking me to the edit page with property_ID parameter, and it's filled out all of the information. Now, we have to talk about the next API call, which is patch. Okay, we're using patch because this historic townhouse exists in our Airbase table. We don't want to replace it. We want to basically update it. We might want to change the title, the description, etc. So that is a patch call. Let's jump into the Airtable documentation and look at how we achieve this. So going down, I see something called update or upsert. Okay, let's have a look. To update property records, issue a request to the properties endpoint. We've done that for all of our calls so far. A patch request will only update the fields included in the request. Brilliant. So we've got patch, URL looks the same as the other ones, but it looks like we have some body data here. Okay, and this body data will be in the same format as create records. Here is data, here it is here. So it's going to be in the same format. So I'm going to save myself some time in the Bubble API connector by just copying and pasting the body into this patch call. And the URL looks the same as this create records call. If I go across, the URL is exactly the same. The only difference is the method. This is post, this is patch. And we do have a content type of application JSON as well. This should be quite straightforward, guys. Let's head back into Bubble. Plugins, Airtable, and I'm going to add another call. Patch listing. Could have called this edit listing, update listing. It doesn't matter. I'm doing this just so it matches the particular method. We're going to do this via a workflow, much like when we create a record, and we're going to choose patch. Brilliant. Now I can save myself some time by copying and pasting a lot of this stuff here. It looks almost identical. In fact, I think it is identical. Paste that in. Base ID. Here it is here. Let's actually move this down. Move down. Paste that in. That can remain private. And we need another one. Content type. That can also remain private. Okay, now I can simply copy this. Paste it in here. Okay, let's copy across the information from the other call. And yeah, let's patch this one here, downtown apartment test, because we can go ahead and update the title. Paste that in. Property ID 11. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and speed this section up. Okay, those are filled in, and I'm going to uncheck private because we need to dynamically feed all of this data from the workflow editor. Now, one thing missing is in the URL, of course, we need to patch a particular property, don't we? So /ID, and we feed the property through here. Uncheck private, so this can be done dynamically. So to get this property ID, we need to actually do this from Bubble through a workflow step. Back to the listings page, and quite a lot has actually changed. So let's do historic townhouse, okay? So the property ID is in the URL. I'm going to expose the URL up here. And here is a property ID. So I'm going to copy this property ID. And it's currently called historic townhouse. So I'm going to paste in this property ID. And I'm going to change the title to historic townhouse. And then patch. And everything else is actually going to change as well. But maybe we should get the URL of the actual image so it matches, so we know what we're looking at. So in Airtable, we have a historic townhouse. Here is an image. And I'm going to copy image address. And paste in that address. Okay, so the image will stay the same and the title will be changed to historic townhouse patch. And then what ID was it? Let's have another look. The ID in here was P005. So 005. Okay, so a few things are going to change. Let me just remind you what it looks like in Airtable. Here is P005, historic townhouse in Sunny Beach, Florida. Okay, let's patch this. So remember, when we initialize a call, we are actually sending data to Airtable. Okay, so if I save that, call is initialized. Let's go over to Airtable. And if I refresh, you can see that we've successfully patched this call. Made a bit of a spelling error here. Okay, so that's a call initialized. Let's set this up in Bubble now. So we go back to the edit page. and it will be on the save button. Add a workflow. We can now find it in plugins patch because we set it as an action. And I'm just going to speed through this to dynamically set this up. Okay, everything is connected. And we can simply go back to the listings page once we've done that. Right, let's load this page. Fantastic. So historic townhouse, this time I'm going to remove the patch. Nice and clean. Let's change a few things. Let's say this is now in New York. Let's say house, size 1700, price 900, and the rest is fine. Okay, so let's patch this. And there we go, guys. Historic townhouse 900. And if I look in Airtable, we've got our historic townhouse in New York for 1700. It's now a house 900 per night. Now to cap off our various methods, we need to be able to obviously delete any kind of data that a user creates. Okay, we always want that full cycle. A user needs to be able to see data, create data, edit data, and delete data. Let's cap this off. So over to the documentation. In the left-hand column, we have delete records. Great. Now I'm familiar with this documentation, so I know that at the bottom of this paragraph, it says you can also delete a request to a records endpoint to delete a single record. And a lot of this documentation pertains to deleting multiple records, and that's fine. But in this course, we're just deleting a single record. So I'm going to click here to look at the single record. Okay, so we're familiar with this pattern. So we see now we've changed the method to delete, and we have same URL again, great. Shared header, done. And this looks a little bit different. Now it says data URL encode. And actually, if I just click this again, that's better. Okay, so that was for a list. We want to delete a single thing. Okay, that was for a list. So with a single thing, we just have to feed the ID, set the method to delete, and that's it, guys. That's all we need to do. Heading over to Bubble. Let's jump into plugins. So we can repurpose a lot of this stuff. So I'm going to actually repurpose this. And in actual fact, why don't we just, let's go duplicate. So I've right-clicked on this particular call. All right, and I'm just going to make sure that I collapse everything I'm not using. So we've got get listings, which is a list, get a single item, create a listing, patch listing, and now patch listing copy. So I'm going to change this to delete listing. That is an action because we're running it from a button. I'm going to change this to delete. And that's actually all we need to do. Now, did we need content type JSON? Let me double check. No, we didn't. Okay, so delete that. We need to dynamically feed the ID, which we're doing. We don't need a body at all. Delete all of this. Delete all of this. Don't need that. Okay, now when we initialize this call, of course, we are running the action and we will be deleting a property. So this ID is for the historic townhouse. So let's go ahead and reinitialize this call. Basically, it's saying reinitialize because we copied the call or we duplicated the call, but it's actually, this is a new call altogether. So let's just look at Airtable first. And here is the historic townhouse that we're going to be deleting. We run this. Click save. And there we go. It just disappeared in front of our eyes. Now, let's build out the bubble side. So let's do this from the listings page and in a pop-up. I've already built a pop-up for this. Okay, so I'm going to open up the repeating group, the card, because I've got that little bin icon at the bottom of this card. Here it is here. Okay, so when a user clicks on that, we want to show the pop-up. Let's say show an element, show the pop-up, delete. Now, obviously, we need to send data to this pop-up. Okay, so I'm going to say display data. And we want to display data into the pop-up. And it will be the listings record. Now it says pop-up delete content type is not set. Okay, let's set that. So that's to make sure that we're deleting the correct record. So if I open this up, this could work. Let me just have a look at this workflow quickly. So if I go to plugins, we initialize the call, so it's showing up in plugins. And if I dynamically feed in the ID, so yeah, it will work. Okay, great. So there's the ID. So we delete that. And we hide the pop-up. And that's that. Okay. So historic townhouse should disappear now because we deleted that from the initialization stage. And let's delete this one here. 2-bed condo in Brooklyn. Click on delete. We've got I added some more information here. So let's first cover that. What I want to do is dynamically feed in the title name. So are you sure you'd like to delete, and then I can feed in the name here. Property, parent groups, records, title. Yeah, that's better. So that's a nice double confirm so we know that we're deleting the correct property. Let's refresh and try this again. 2-bed condo in Brooklyn. Let's delete that. Yep, property, 2-bed condo in Brooklyn. We could have bolded that if we like. Go ahead and delete. I might actually need a page refresh after this. So I've just refreshed the page and 2-bed condo has disappeared. Let's confirm in Airtable and 2-bed condo, I don't see it. Yeah, that's definitely gone. Okay guys, so there you have it. So we were able to get listings from an external database or external table from Airtable and set up a fully functioning app without our own bubble database using this particular API method to get our data, to get a single record, to create records, edit them, and delete them as well. And obviously I've been using the verbs interchangeably when I say edit. Of course I mean patch, etc. But like I said from the start of the course, RESTful APIs follow a similar pattern. The verbs, they might be slightly different, but the patterns are very, very familiar. Now, I'm going to do one more chapter because I want to show you some popular documentation from OpenAI, which I'm sure you'll be using at some stage in your journey. So let's tackle that next. So I've logged into platform.openai.com. You can use the same login as you use for ChatGPT. And I've added credits to my account so I can access OpenAI as a developer would through the API. And then I've clicked on Quick Start over here. And I've had a read of the documentation, scrolled down, and it says, make your first API request. Great. Now by default, this was set to JavaScript. We've talked about always look for curl or CURL. So I've clicked the toggle. And look, REST API. Perfect. So here we have an example of what the call looks like. So this looks good. And then down the left-hand side, we have all the different types of capabilities, such as text generation, image generation, being able to look at images basically and give feedback based on uploaded images, audio generation, the list goes on. Let's click on text generation. Quick start, fantastic. I can see that there's a drop down here and I know that this is JavaScript, so I'm going to change this to curl. And all I want to do is connect to OpenAI and make sure that there is a connection and that I can talk to the large language model. Okay, and if we want to basically interact with OpenAI, we're going to be using a post call. There's not going to be a get call because what are you getting? This is conversations. So in order to have a conversation with someone, you have to speak to them. So that's what a post call does, remember? So we're going to be sending data and then receiving a response from OpenAI. So I'm going to copy this URL. Beneath that, I can see we have a header, content type, and we have authorization, bearer, space with the OpenAI key. And that is familiar because that's basically what we did when we were creating records with Airtable. Both are RESTful. Both follow a similar pattern. Okay, so I've gone ahead, I've collapsed Airtable, and I've just added a few details here, such as my key that have gone ahead of time and done. Now we need another shared header. This one is called content type. Application JSON. Now last time we were adding the content type to particular calls, and that's because some calls needed this header and some calls didn't. But I know as a fact with OpenAI, you always want to be adding content type application JSON at the shared section. That's in the documentation. Now I want to save some time here. I want to use the import another call from curl here. So back in the documentation, I can see this copy button. So let's do that. Now it is going to copy everything, right? It's going to copy content type, which we've already done, and authorization. It's copying everything here. That's okay. We'll just delete what we don't need. And then I'm going to click here, paste that in, import, and then I can delete both of these because I don't need them. Let's call this text generation. And that is of course an action because we need a multi-line input with a button. We're not going to build that out, but just think how you interact with ChatGPT at the moment. You have an input and a button, therefore it's an action. Bubble already picked up that this is a post call. And this is what I like about it. It's just added the JSON body here for us to set dynamic values. Okay, so the way OpenAI works, I'm not going to get too much into it, but basically we ask a question, but we also have context to who OpenAI needs to be. So we could say that the system currently is set to you are a helpful assistant. We could set this dynamically so our users can determine this, or we can hard code it. We could say you are a grade 12 math teacher. You are a scientist. You are a wellness expert. We're going to leave it as a helpful assistant because this is just general. But what I already want to be able to do is to make sure that we can communicate with OpenAI, okay? So naturally this would be dynamically set. So I'm going to say content. and then paste in a testing value and uncheck private so that a user can interact with this model. The other thing to note is that we can switch out to use any model we like. This is currently set to GPT 4.0. I'm sure that this will be updated to a brand new model very soon. There's also O1 and Mini available, but GPT 4.0 is fine for testing. Okay, so that's it. So let's look at this again. It's the same as Airtable. We made a start, we gave it a name. We looked at the documentation and I found that it is a private key and header with bearer space, the API key available to me in my admin dashboard in OpenAI. The documentation said that we needed content type application JSON because we're dealing with JSON data. Then on the call itself, I named it text generation. That's just for me. And I can actually see that it's set to data, so that would not actually have worked correctly. I'm going to set that to action. Setting it as an action then means that we can dynamically feed through the content, what a user types in an input or a multi-line input. We can dynamically feed that through from the workflow editor. Okay, and then the rest was done for us by Bubble by importing another call from curl. All right, I'm going to go ahead and initialize this, and what I'm expecting back from OpenAI is an answer. I'm asking OpenAI to write a haiku about recursion in programming. Let's rather say write a haiku about running in New York. Why not? Something I love to do at Bubble's annual conference. Initialize the call. Okay, and a lot of information here, but what I want to really pull your attention to is the message that we received. Okay, so message, role, assistant. The response that OpenAI gave me was footsteps pound the streets, skyscrapers watch silently, rush of city air. Pretty good haiku. But the main thing is that we have initialized this call. We have successfully been able to communicate with OpenAI, and we've received a response to the question that we asked. The documentation for OpenAI is stunning, so I hope that this gave you a quick preview of what to expect. Lastly, we're going to also have a look at Stripe documentation, because Stripe is the world's leading API payments platform, and I think at some point in your journey, you might be using Stripe as well. So let's have a look at the user experience for Stripe payments. So let's say that I'd like to book this suburban house, okay? So I'm going to click on that. This is something we didn't actually build because we were out of time, and I'd rather just show you in the demo app. All right, so it's $350 per night to book. I'm going to go ahead and click on the book button. And this takes me to basically a page called book. And what I've done is gone ahead of time, set up the API connector with Stripe, which we're going to review after I've made a successful booking. But I wanted to show you the user experience first. So I fill out my information. And then I can use these Bubble plugins for the check-in and checkout. So let's say from Friday through to Sunday. So 2 nights, it's $350 times 2 is $700. So now I want to click on this. It takes me to, you can see in the URL, checkout.stripe.com. All right, this is my test account. And here is how much I'm going to be charged. Stripe provides test card details, which I'm going to enter in now. I can see that it's already saved. Here's a name from testing earlier. And a random postcode. I'm going to go ahead and pay. And it's at this stage that Stripe is actually handling all of this for us. This is why we want to use APIs, because all of the heavy lifting is usually done by the service. So if I go ahead and do that, processing, and there we go. That's now taking me to a page called confirmation that I built earlier. And in the URL, I'm using a session ID returned from Stripe with some information that allows me to basically go find data about this payment and then use that data. Okay, here we've got the check-in, checkout dates that are set, booking reference. This is something I've created from a Stripe reference myself. And that would be the user experience. But let's have a look at the Stripe documentation to see how I did this. So the Stripe documentation is vast, okay? And the particular workflow we just ran was called a checkout session. And what a checkout session is, it's a Stripe hosted page. I always use this. Can you build your own widgets for payments? Yes, you can, but it's hard. You'll probably need to use a plugin. You'll probably need to know a bit of JavaScript. Well, if you use a plugin, that's fine. You can use a plugin. If you don't use a plugin and you want to build your own checkout experience, you will need to know a bit of JavaScript. I prefer to use checkout session, a Stripe hosted page with my own branding. You can brand it with your brand colors, logo, etc. because there is a lot to payments. A person puts in their card details. You'll need to feed back if those card details are correct. Maybe the card's expired. Maybe the card is fraudulent. The transaction could be fraudulent. Maybe there is no money left in the account. Anyway, I digress. I don't want to get into that too much, but I know that what I tend to use is the checkout session, and you should also use checkout sessions when you can within Stripe. So what I did was I created a session, and it says create a session creates a session object. Over on the right hand side, I can see that curl is already selected from a previous test that I ran. It says it's a post call. Great. Here's the URL, api.stripe.com v1 checkout sessions. Stripe needs the secret key, which is available in my Stripe dashboard. And what's quite important here is that Stripe doesn't use a JSON body. They always want basically URL encoded, which we're going to look at in a second. But that's something that threw me when I first started using Stripe, is they do it a little bit differently. Still straightforward to understand, a little bit different on the implementation side. So this is the basic requirement, but you can send a lot of information to Stripe, and you can send all sorts of metadata. What I did is I also sent to Stripe some booking information that the user made. 2 nights, start date, end date, final amount, that kind of thing. But the documentation is lovely. It is straightforward to read, and you will become familiar with it over time. But let's see what it looks like in Bubble. So because Stripe has a test dashboard, much like Bubble has a test environment, I put the keys into the development value and not in the live value. In the documentation, it's nice and clear. It says that the call headers need to have content type and then this value here. Okay. And then what I did was I created a call called checkout session. I named it checkout session just so I know exactly what it is. This is down to me. I set it as an action because we clicked a button to make this booking. We know it's a post call. We can see that in the documentation. And we also saw in the documentation that this was the URL. Now for the fun bits. So in OpenAI, we used the body JSON object. That's how we constructed the call. What Stripe uses is URL encoded, where it's just key value pairs. So mode is payment. Customer email, you can set the customer email. I've unchecked private because that would be dynamically fed via the workflow, which we'll have a look at. Stripe also wants a success URL. What happens on a successful payment? Where do you send the user? What happens when a user clicks cancel or back from the Stripe hosted page? And then just all of the information such as in what currency, USD? What's the price? With Stripe, they want price and cents. So I filled out all of this test information so that I was able to initialize the call. Okay. And one thing to note, when using Stripe, you have to check query string for every single key value pair that you create. And to create more, all you do is click on add parameter and off you go. Then I'd click query string. Okay. Now I have a significant free Bubble Stripe course available on YouTube right now. So if you go ahead, I will link it in the description below, but you can also search Bubble Stripe course and you will get a significant course. And I go through all of this in that particular course. But I just wanted to show you what it looks like working with Stripe. Now, what about the Bubble workflow itself? Well, from the book page, which I showed you earlier, we have the book button. After initializing the call, I was able to find Stripe in the plugin section, Stripe checkout session. And then what I've just showed you right now are the key value pairs that you had set dynamically. So I've fed through the email address. I've created some logic here to determine how many nights and fed through whatever I wanted, basically. And then after you create a checkout session, Stripe then returns a URL. And that URL is what you redirect the user to, which is the hosted Stripe page. Okay, I'm not going to go any further on this because if you're new to APIs, this might be tricky to understand, but you will become familiar with it over time. Now, please go ahead and do that Stripe course if you want to learn about Stripe, because we don't need any plugins. We do everything through the API connector, which means you have access to the entire Stripe API suite once you become familiar with the Stripe documentation. Folks, I hope you enjoyed this course. I have one ask. If you enjoyed this, please let me know in the comments below. Ask me anything you like in the comments and I'll get around to answering them as well. For now, take care and I'll see you soon.